Anyway, Carlton King, the former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but also looks at the world of geopolitics, that world that encompasses everything I've just mentioned, but puts together what the political realities are, the realpolitik, if you will, of how the world functions, and the secret world fits extremely tidily into that process. So normally, over the last couple of weeks, what I've been doing is, indeed over the last couple of months, I've worked a lot of my show with my sidekick, the one and only Fergus Isaac. And the reason for that is, of course, that what I get then is a journalistic perspective on the geopolitical perspective. And the reason why I've done that is because the fact of the matter is that journalism conveys the thoughts of the government to the masses to a lesser or greater degree. You know, sometimes we try and pride ourselves in the United Kingdom on suggesting that somehow the media doesn't control us. It does. And the thoughts of the media and how the media perceives what we should be doing, the stories that the media puts across, are all controlled in that way. But today, it's not going to be one of those issues, not going to be one of those episodes. Today, it's going to be one of my critical thinking episodes, which I do now and then. And those episodes are where I delve deeply into the world of secret intelligence and national security on a particular theme. And I do that so the listeners, you guys listening right now, can critically think about an issue. So without talking very much around it, let's get straight into what I'm going to actually speak about. Really, it's all surrounding Russia and what used to be the Soviet Union, etc., etc. Why? Because I've had a lot of, not particularly calls, but emails or texts or tweets, which basically ask various questions. One of them, and that's probably a result of the fact that I was on BBC television talking about this, which was David Smith, the English security guard at the German embassy, who was recently arrested for spying on behalf of Russia. So I will answer some questions relating to that. I'll also answer questions relating to the Azov Brigade, or as it is now, regiment of the Ukrainian Army, or the Ukrainian Armed Forces, because it also is an interesting point, and people have mentioned, you know, what is it, where is it, how is it connected, etc., and is it neo-Nazi? Third, I will be talking about the Nordstream, and I had quite a long email from a guy, no it wasn't, it was a WhatsApp, from a guy regarding the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and who was responsible for that. So that will also be part of this week's. And what I'm going to really say now ahead of time, there's so much there that it's going to be this week's and next week's episode that I'm now recording. And fourthly, what we wanted to look at was shock and awe, because that was a question that was put to me some time ago. And if you remember, just at the time of the beginning of the war with Russia and the Ukraine, I actually stated that there would not be shock and awe. And I've had some notes about that. And for those who don't know what shock and awe is, it's a military doctrine. I don't think it was put together by General Schwarzkopf, but he used the term shock and awe when he spoke about the Second Gulf War and the US's attack on Iraq. Basically, what the US did is, over a period of about, I think it was 17 days, but from day one, they basically destroyed and degraded the capacity of the Iraqis to defend themselves, particularly from air cover. And they destroyed a lot of the central areas, destroyed a lot of things like power stations, anything that could aid the military activity to win or indeed defend itself against the American and coalition forces, which obviously include the United Kingdom, who were ranged against it. So this is where we are. That's what I'm going to talk about. But I think the first thing what I should do, because otherwise if we don't, I should sit this in a military context, and I should sit it in a historical military context. Because if I don't think I'm going to really be able to answer some of the questions that have been put to me or suggested that I should be answering. So, yeah, let's kick off historically. So, we're looking at Russia. And before, obviously, we've got to the Russia that we've got post-1991-2, the Russian Federation, which is called, we had the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, which was, of course, formed in 1917, and the battles thereafter to bring it, I think, to 1923, when it actually became the full Soviet Union, after the battles that they had with the old Tsarist or White Russian forces to complete the revolution that started in 1917 as a result of the First World War and the massive losses that the Russians sustained during the First World War. And basically, it was an attempt by the generally poorer classes. Don't get me wrong, there had already been Bolshevism moving forward, so communism moving forward to try and cause some strife within Russia. But I think the First World War really brought that to a crescendo insofar as the losses that were being sustained by the Russians in the First World War were such that the people just did not want to continue fighting that war anymore, especially when we needed to understand Russia, that basically the serfs, the average people, rather than the bourgeoisie or the middle classes and the upper classes, had no say in what happened in Russia at all. So therefore, what were they fighting for? And what were they, more importantly, dying for? So that was basically why I think the revolution was, in many ways, quite successful. So it's estimated that out of the 16 million Russian soldiers that fought the war during the First World War, and by the way, that's only up to 1917, they lost about 5.5 million killed or wounded. Now, let me contextualise that if you put both world wars together in the United Kingdom, then what you'll find is that, and this is what becomes problematic, because when you talk about the United Kingdom, then what you have to look at is really what are we classing as United Kingdom losses? And I'll explain that. At the time of the First World War, Britain basically controlled about a third of the world's population in its empire and a third of the world's population. So therefore, when we talk about the losses in the First World War and what those losses were, you can bring into that British Empire losses. And so it's quite difficult to take the imperial aspect out of it. So they're about 900,000. So that's the First World War. The Second one was, again, Britain still controlled those areas. Indeed, you could argue it controlled even more of the world's population in those days. And our losses, but we were able to narrow down our losses in terms of how we measured losses. Because in the Second World War, actually Britain did measure the losses of Great Britain. So it was able to say these were the losses of Great Britain, and these are then the losses of the imperial countries. So, Indian losses, 3 million. The losses for Australia, I think, were about... New Zealand, about 11,000. Losses for Canada were about 40,000, I believe. Losses for Australia were about 34,000. So you can see that Australia was 34,000. You had Hong Kong losses were about 100,000. Malaysian losses were around that sort of figure. So when you look at the war losses, you can add them up that way. Losses for people fighting from the Caribbean, obviously they're very, very small places, the Caribbean, but, they were in the thousands. Losses for the Africans in the British Empire were in the tens of thousands. So again, you can see how the British losses were calculated. And then, of course, there was losses for, as I said, I don't think I said the figure, losses for the UK, Great Britain itself, and those losses were 450,000. Now, why do I mention these losses in this First World War and Second World War? Because I've just said to you that the Russian imperial forces lost 5.5 million in the First World War, but that was chicken feed in comparison to the losses in the Second World War. So in the Second World War, for the Soviet Union, Soviet losses, it's said to be around 27 million, not hundreds of thousands, 27 million people. So some even say those losses were way higher than 27 million people, that they were up to 40 million. We know that Chinese losses, example, in the Second World War, which nobody ever speaks about, was about 30 million people lost their lives. So in reality, in Britain, the biggest losses for the United Kingdom and Empire were India with 3 million, which was 5 times as many losses in those 3 million civilians and soldiers, 3 million, than what the mother country, Great Britain, suffered. So this is contextualising the war, the Second World War. Why do I mention that? Because that's, old history. Because if you're a country that suffered something like 27 million, let's just use the low figure, 27 million people, you then don't want to see a war where you're caught out again. And this is what people have to understand. We talk about the Second World War all the time and say it was disastrous, and we say we'll never let this happen again, and that's why we justify our nuclear forces, etc., etc. What would be the case if those losses were 28 times that, like they were in the Soviet Union? In fact, it's not 28 times, is it? It's 40, 50, 58 times those losses. So we lost 450,000, if you're just talking Great Britain, and we say we need to defend ourselves, and they lost 27 million, and by the way, as I said, that's a low figure. Of course they're going to say they have to defend themselves. Now, of course, in that 27 million, this is where we now start getting more into the depth of it, we've got to understand that some of those losses, many of them, were in the parts of the Soviet Union that are no longer parts of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had 15 Soviets that made it up, the biggest Soviet being Russia, but others like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and of course what we're now talking about, Ukraine, Belarus, these were all different parts of the Soviet Union. So in the Ukrainian Soviet, they lost a lot of people because a lot of battles went down there in Kiev and various other places, and Dnipro and all those other places where the war was being fought. So when you talk about losses of the Soviet Union, you're not talking about just Russian losses. You're talking about the losses that came from all parts of what was then the Soviet Union. So why does that make a difference? Because then you'd suggest that the Ukraine should be aware about what losses are. And I think the figure was around 3 to 5 million, something like that, losses. Now, the reality is, though, of course, and this is where it becomes problematic, is that some of the people of the Ukraine fought on the side of the Germans. And there were units which were basically SS units that were Ukrainian units. So German, what you would say the German SS, but they were Ukrainian SS units, like the Gleitzen SS unit. And those units went out and basically butchered other Ukrainians who believed in communism, who were Soviets, who were Jews, who were gypsies, people who they believed were not true Aryans. And there's one of the guy who many in the Ukraine see as a great guy, Stefan Bandera, who was part of that unit, who had before been fighting the Russians, because he was part of the White Russian battle, but also within the Second World War was primary actor within that, with the units that were fighting on the side of the Germans. Now, why is that of interest? Because one of the questions I've been asked is about the Azov Brigade, their regiment, and they look up to people like that as patriots. So they would see those who fought on the Nazi side as patriots of the Ukraine, because they wanted to break away from the Soviet Union. So when you hear Putin talking about Nazis, this is whom he's referring to. Organisations like the Azov Brigade, and there are many others. Now, is this just something made up by Russia? No. If you go back 7, 8, 5, 4 years even, you will find many a report made by American, British, German, French, trying to think of the ones I've seen, who basically write about the dangers of the Azov Brigade and others like them that make up the right-wing collective that were part of the Ukraine and became part of the Ukrainian armies after the Maidan Revolution. Now, that revolution was one that kicked out the pro-Russian president of the Ukraine and placed into it then a positive Western Ukrainian president of the Ukraine. Now, why did I understand or get involved in this? Well, when I was in Special Branch many, many years ago, we had a guy who used to he was on the Eastern Europe section, but before that, actually, he used to collect a lot of information about what he called the war criminals sitting in the United Kingdom who should be tried for basically mass murder and their actions against the murdering of Ukrainian people. And these are obviously other Ukrainians. Now, he had done a lot of research on it and put a lot together on it. It never got anywhere because what we needed to understand is after the Second World War ended, indeed, shortly before the end of the Second World War, and the threat was perceived by the West as being the Soviet Union. Now the war had been won, and again, you need to understand that of the 7 million German soldiers who lost their lives in the Second World War, something like 5.9 million of them lost their war on the Eastern Front, their lives on the Eastern Front. So in other words, the Red Army bled out the German army rather than the Western armies, Britain, the United States, Britain, French and various others. Because the reality was the fighting was done in the East. And the fighting was done in the East in a completely different way. There was no kind of Colditz Castle for people escaping. basically, if you were starved to death as a prisoner of war by the Germans in many camps, or if you tried to escape, you were just executed. And indeed, if you were a commissar, and I'll explain this, which is in the commissars, unlike in the German army where you had two different units, which was basically the regular German army, the Wehrmacht, and then you had Hitler's own original own army, which was the SS, the Schutzstaffel, so that means protective squadron. Basically, those two units were different. They even had different ranks. So, they had things like a captain was a Sturmbannführer rather than a Hauptmann. So the ranks were different, etc., etc. And those units, they were right-wing German units, we call them right-wing, whatever National Socialism was. You could spin it either way you want to play it. But socialism in one state, which is what everything for the national body, which is what Nazism is. It's actually the National German Workers' Party. That was what made up Hitler's power. And so he had effectively a separate army, which it provided with the best gear, the best capacity, and Aryans were the ones who could enter it only in the beginning anyway. And you had to be a party member or you had to be infused with the party's ideals to be part of the SS. And they were seen to be the best people in Germany. So that's how that body functioned within and separate to the German general normal imperial army, but it was an integral part of the armed forces. Now, the reason why I mention that is that's basically what the Azov Regiment Brigade was. It was a regiment in Ukraine. It is a regiment of individuals who believe in the glory of the Ukraine, who believe in the fact that Ukrainians are Aryans, and if you listen to what they've said and been saying, and this has been reported, way before the war started, that it believes that the fact that as Aryans, it is saving Western Europe culturally, so they're white supremacists, and it believes that that the Ukraine is, if you will, the cradle of what should continue to be European superiority. So that basically a national superiority of the Ukraine. So that is what the Azov Brigade, and they look to organisations like, example, Islamic State, because they perceive the Islamic State doing what they're doing, and they see them as a welcome foe, a foe that they can respect because they're standing up for their rights, as the Islamic State was, as they perceived it. And we, as the Azov Brigade and many of the right-wing brigades it's just the Azov becomes number one of the Ukraine, as fellow individuals standing up for their beliefs, and it's a class of civilization. It's the old-fashioned holy war, if you will, for want of a better perspective. So that brigade, yes, to the writer who asked me the question, yes, it is a right-wing organisation. Yes, it is part of the Ukrainian National Army, but it's controlled by its own people. And I would suggest it's similar to the SS. Now, they may say they're not Nazis or neo-Nazis, but the evidence would seem to suggest that generally they are. They used some of the old tactics before the war actually broke out. They'd use some of the street tactics of the Braunhemden, the brown shirts, and they controlled the streets in Kiev and various other cities at one stage to bring what they called law and order to it. So its tactical understanding was that of an army within an army, and it's now been enfolded and encompassed into the Ukrainian army. It doesn't stand alone. You can see that actually in the United States forces. You have a problem which was accepted by the United States in its military that there are people who are basically right-wing extremists, and this can happen in many other armies. My point was, I was in the Ukraine, some 13 years ago, more than a decade ago anyway, doing some work there on behalf of our government, doing some work there, and at the time, I had the pleasure of speaking with some of the guys and gals. I went out in advance. Some of the guys and gals in government in the Ukraine and in Western Ukraine before Maidan and before the split that there was, and before the separatists in Eastern Russia decided to move away from the union of the Ukraine, and before the Russians moved in their individuals who they said weren't special forces, which clearly were special forces, to aid the liberation, as they would perceive it, of these Eastern Ukrainians or Western Russians, depending on which way you look at it. So obviously a game was being played by Putin, a game which is played around the world in the secret world. So, we're not giving any negative to either side here. But what I will say is, I wrote a paper when I came back. I was and basically what I said is there is a danger there in the Ukraine that, good guys as they were, most of these people were English speaking, some of them were actually English, born in the United Kingdom, to parents who were Ukrainians, because after the war, as I said, we took a lot of the Ukrainian Nazis and brought them to Britain and to the United States because they knew about the Soviet Union, and the next war was going to be the battle against the Soviet Union. So you wanted everybody who knew about the Soviet Union to provide you with information. So that's why we had aided some of these people who were, running camps or running death squads or whatever, and we brought them back to Britain. And the Yanks, the Americans, have brought them back to the United States. And so that's why that had happened at that particular stage. And so the children of these people were in schools in Britain and obviously in the United States and in Canada and elsewhere. And I had a good friend who was a child of one of these people. I'm not saying that his father was involved in any of the death camps or anything like that, but he was clearly part of the units that would have been, and this is the point, that would have been imprisoned or even worse by Stalin had they not been brought out. So this is where the war throws a very, very wide and dark shadow over everything. So what happened is when I was there talking to these guys, daughters and sons of some of these people who came from the West, who were now helping to run the Ukraine, they were totally and utterly anti-Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Indeed, they didn't see them as Russian-speaking Ukrainians, they saw them as Russians. And I said to not one of these guys, several of them, who were standing there I was talking with, and I said, listen, you're not going to cause a problem by basically what they said they were doing is wanting to prevent the Russian speakers in the East from speaking Russian, wanting to say that they wouldn't get pensions if they didn't speak Russian, etc., if they didn't speak Ukrainian and just kept on speaking Russian, etc., etc., and preventing it being spoken in schools, Russian, etc., etc., etc. So I said, are you not going to cause a problem? And it's interesting because I was discussing with one fella and I said, well, this is basically what Idi Amin Dada was doing. Idi Amin Dada, if you don't know about that, I'm talking about in Uganda, basically said you're either a Ugandan or you're an Indian, Pakistani, or whatever you are, or a British person, when they're talking about East African Asians. Because what happened is, if you don't know in that conflict, and you may think I'm jumping around, but I'm just explaining the circumstance. What happened in that conflict back in the 60s was that Idi Amin Dada then became the president of Uganda, a very bad man, by the way. He basically said, listen, make your choice now, throw away your British passports and become Ugandans, or choose to be British and get out of the country. Right. And I said, that didn't bode well for Uganda. And I said, it isn't going to bode well for the Ukraine if you're going to do that with Russians at a far larger number. Because I said that whole eastern region of your country is full of people who are, Russians, Russian heritage. So you need to sue for peace with that, not cause strife. And I remember coming back writing the paper saying that this was going to be a problem. And lo and behold, it became a problem. And we see what we see. Now, I'm not putting any rights and wrongs on it. I'm just telling you what happened. And I'm telling you what others then subsequently would see when this became then a structure of what was going to be later, what was the buffer between what is now Russia and what is the Ukraine. Add to that, of course, that there was the feel that the Ukraine wanted to be part of the European Union. Now, I've gone through all this on something that I did 9 months ago, and I don't profess to go or want to go through it again. No, it wasn't 9 months, a year ago, before when the invasion happened. But suffice to say, trying to be part of the European Union and trying to be part of NATO was going to always cause a problem. And the Ukrainian leadership that I met knew that. So it's just one of those things. What we need to understand with Russia is that what you found as the biggest problem for Russia was that when the Soviet Union fell and it was no longer communist, indeed there was a stage, I think it's been in 1993 when they supposedly have elections, that the Communist Party of Russia actually was going to get elected into some areas of Russia. And I know we in the West took some aided some packages to prevent that sort of happening again, the re-emergence, if you will, of communism. So we created a totally Western orientated capitalist system, in fact uber capitalism, using the German word, which basically meant that it was a winner-take-all, and generally the winners were bad geezers, and those winners became the oligarchs who had more money than anybody else. At one stage, I think it was something like 12 people had the vast majority of the wealth in Russia. So I'm not putting up Russia as a holy light. What I am saying is, because we were so, let's use the word, complicit in allowing the Yeltsin government to rape and pillage its people and allowing us to open business, to push business in that didn't take any account of the Russian people, there was always going to be a backlash of somebody who would not be corrupted by that process and would come in and say, listen, we used to be great, now we're down on our knees, now we've got grandmothers selling their bodies to get a warm cup of soup. This should not happen in Russia. And this hard man or woman who would take over could, I believed, way back in the 1990s, cause a resurgence of Russian nationalism. And that's basically what you got with President Putin. Right, so you've now got two forces looking at each other. Both of those forces used to be in the Soviet Union, one with a nationalism that talks about the Ukraine that is basically, fascist, white, racist, from some of its people, and you've got on the Russian side ultra-nationalist, repressive in many ways, a body that itself is, I wouldn't necessarily say that they were. Let me think about it. No, I wouldn't say that the ideology is neo-Nazi in Russia. Not at all. No way, shape or means. I would say that what it is Russian nationalist. So there is a difference between the two. And that I wouldn't say that they were necessarily white supremacists either, in the Russian perspective of it. So nor is the whole of the Ukraine. But what I'm saying is that what has happened is that the right wing in Ukraine has taken over to a great extent and taken over a lot of the power there. So in answer to your question, that's where we go with the Azov Brigade. Right, so David Smith. Now, the reason why David Smith is connected is because his wife was a Russian, as I understand it, and he bore some a Russian of, I think, of Russian extraction Ukrainian. I think that's what we're talking about. But he believed in the fact that these Russian-speaking Ukrainians, read for that Russia as well, because there's no doubt about it, Russia was aiding and assisting the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, that they should basically have the Donbass as part of Russia. And so, as I understand it, initially his actions were ideological. Now, did he want to receive money at the same time? It appears as though it was. I think a good job was done by SL15, which is a successor to some extent of Special Branch. It isn't really, because in the branch, obviously, you would only be dealing with political events, and you would have been brought up in the branch all the way through from, 3, 4, 5 years of your police service, when you were selected through a very, very strenuous selection process into Special Branch. You could put all your career in the branch. With SL15, which is called the Counter-Terrorism Command, there's a lot more in and out movement from other different parts of the Met. So it doesn't have the same, if you will, secret intelligence understanding and capacity of its officers as did Special Branch, but it is the body that deals with issues that are political and that are terrorist or espionage orientated in the United Kingdom when those cases need to come to court. And if you don't understand, which is what I had to explain on the BBC programme, and I did quite a few radio station programmes as well, what I needed to explain was that when people talk about it's MI5 that carried out these actions, that's not the case. Yes, by the way, the real name of MI5 is the Security Service. Yes, the Security Service aided and assisted, and I'm not going to go into anything sensitive here because, we are hypersensitive in the UK about giving secrets away. So I'm not going to go into anything hypersensitive at all. But suffice to say that once something becomes in any way criminal, the Security Service officers do not have the power to do anything about it. The power lies with the police, and the body that tends to do that is now in the Met SL15 that used to be Special Branch. And so therefore the sting operation put in place with or without the assistance of the Security Service, and I would suggest with the assistance of the Security Service in some ways, but the sting that was carried out under the auspices of the Metropolitan Police of Scotland Yard's SL15 and Counter-Terrorism Command. And the job was that, yes, now they have been informed, and I'm not sure which way it came now, because the way I understood it was that the information was probably originally obtained by the Germans. And that could either be the Bundesverfassungsschutz, because the Germans, unlike practically every other country, the Germans run around about the same system we do, which is you have a security service, MI5 in Britain, and then you have a police body in ours, SL15 of Scotland Yard, that carry out any policing aspect to a security problem. In Germany, they have the same. They have a thing called the Bundesverfassungsschutz. Actually, it's even more complicated than that to understand. And I used to liaise with them, so it's a more complicated aspect than that, because the Germans have a lot of police and intelligence service power sits in what they call Länder, which the best thing would be like a state for America or a county for Britain. And these Länder have the Landesverfassungsschutz. So they have each land has its own constitutional protective body, which is what it means, a security service. In each of these Länder, of 15 Länder there, of Germany, they all have their own security service. And then there's the Bundes, which means federal, which sits over the top of that. So they have these bodies that sit within their own land. So in Berlin, it will have its own Landesverfassungsschutz. And then above and beyond, the Bundesverfassungsschutz. Right. Now, for the police, you've got the police body that's carrying out the SL15, the yard task, when it's in any way criminal, is called the Bundeskriminalamt. Right. Now, the problem is, again, each of the states have their own Landeskriminalamt. So they will have a body that picks it up if it just stays within the borders of the land. Right, so in the borders of the state, right. So in that, these four different bodies who are working to look at this, and I suspect that somehow, and it probably worked, either the BKA or the Berlin Landeskriminalamt found out about this guy's actions, but I'm guessing it's the BKA, the federal body, because they're more orientated to espionage as well, that the federal body found out about this. And then if it's anything like how it used to be when I was in Special Branch, I actually did the liaison with the Germans and the Austrians and the Swiss, because I'm obviously one of their speakers. So I liaise with those colleagues in those services, and so they would have been able to pass that information to us. And by the way, one of the roles I was going to take over before Special Branch was disbanded back in 2006 for the Counter-Terrorism Command, I was already set up and ready to go and sit in either at the time it was Wiesbaden, is going to end up in Berlin, to sit in there with German colleagues and work with them on issues that connected between ourselves, the United Kingdom and Germany. Or, if I did so choose, because I'm a Dutch speaker as well, if I did so choose, to actually go and sit in the Netherlands or in Belgium, where they got Flemish, which is basically like Dutch, sit with them from their side. So I was even going to look at one of the other two areas. So there was so what I'm trying to explain to you is there's a great connection between the forces, and so the information will be passed over. Then operations can be put in place, and then they'd work closely together. Now, from the way I understand it, it was said to be joint with the security service, SO15, which suggests to me then that it may have come from the Bundesverfassungsschutz directly to the security service and then to 15. Or 15 inform the security service because of the security aspect of it, because they do have national responsibility for the intelligence of espionage. Obviously, for the policing thereof, that's going to be in the Met. Because what you need to understand is, in Britain, that's the same as in Germany, the security services, Bundesverfassungsschutz, Landesverfassungsschutz, and in Britain, the security service, MI5, have no powers of arrest. They can't arrest people, they cannot question people, cannot bring them in front of a court, etc. Only the police can do that, and it would be the Bundeskriminalamt or Landeskriminalamt, or it would be in Britain the SO15, the Counter-Terrorism Command, that would do that. Because somebody said to me, wrote saying, "Oh, what's the Met's Counter-Terrorism Command doing on something that's got to do with espionage?" Well, they just changed the name to the Counter-Terrorism Command. Bad name, because it doesn't encompass everything they do. Whereas the Special Branch encompassed everything, but they changed the branch, and they also changed the structure. Not just the name, the structure was changed, which was, by the way, a very, very negative thing to do, because it undermined the professionalism within the Metropolitan Police of a body of men and women who were intelligence officers as well as police officers, right? And that intelligence was everything they worked from day in, day out, all day long. So that was a negative aspect back in 2006 of this disbanding. So an operation was put then to try and capture this guy in the act of undertaking something, and it's very clear how you do that. And as I understand it, again, this is not secret because it's come out, they basically put some actors together now, whether they were security service officers or whether they were officers from SO15 or whether they were officers from, in some ways, the German assistance that was put forward. Either way, whichever way you want to play it, there was a joint operation, and the individual was made to think that the people who he saw and thought were Foreign Office personnel were indeed officers who were carrying out an action that would allow for 15 to arrest the person, because they were going to then follow him on and see what he was going to do with the information, which of course meant filming, looking at mail, looking at all of the technical capacity that he may have had to hand stuff over, etc., in tandem with Germans, because obviously the action's happening on German soil. So therefore, what you then had is a minimum tripartite operation, which went on, and the individual was caught. It was then they realised, because obviously the Germans would have done the bank accounts, etc., that the individual was obviously being paid as well at some level. But I think in questioning by the 15 guys, I think it became very, very clear that there was obviously a element of a fundamental element, actually, of it being a belief factor that he wanted, why he took out his actions. Now, whether that was an anti-British belief factor or a pro-Russian belief factor, I don't know. The judge seemed to suggest that it was pro-Russian, but he also seemed to suggest in equal measure that the motivation was anti-British. So I don't know which one, because I wasn't there doing any questioning of the individual. But it seems to be a mixed match. Generally, if you're in my game, because as you know, I was in both parts of the game, if you will, countering espionage and then performing espionage. If you're performing espionage and trying to recruit somebody to your cause, you always want to know what the motivation is. Why do they want to do it? And so that is absolutely important. Now, coming back to this guy, and one of the questions was that somebody asked me is, how could he just go to the Russians? Now, as I understand it originally, I don't think the Russians believed him. I'm not certain whether the operation was an FSB operation or a GRU operation. Let's explain. GRU is the Russian, it was in the Soviet Union times and still is now. It's the body that is part of the army. So it's a military intelligence body, practically. So he's apparently gone to or tried to get in touch with the military attaché in the Russian embassy to sell his wares. So that might suggest that it was picked up by the GRU. But it could just as easily be that general said, hey, listen, and passed it over to the resident SVR, which the SVR is in the old days it was all KGB in the Soviet Union, be it the external directorates or the internal directorates. So what's happened now is those external directorate and the internal directorate have split. So you've got the SVR, which is external, and you've got the FSB, which is internal. So you've now got a split of it, whereas in the old days it was all one encompassing body with different directorates. I think in one Dzerzhinsky place, the internal body used to be the internal body of the KGB. Now they're split bodies, so they're split. So you've got an external body, internal body, and you've still got the old Russian military intelligence body. And by the way, again, I was asked the question, MI5 is not military intelligence. I mean, that just gives it a designation. Military intelligence is a completely different body. MI5 is a civilian body. They're not soldiers, they are civilians. So let's just push that out of the way. So that's the security service as civilians. So, So what I'm saying is that when he first went there, Smith, to try and sell his wares, I understand that he was thought to be a dangle. Now, in the game that we play, in the intelligence game, as it's called, the Great Game, as it used to be called many, many, many years ago, even between the Indian operations going across into Afghanistan and on into the Russian Empire, way back in the 1880s, it was called the Great Game. In the intelligence game, secret intelligence game, there's a thing called a dangle, which is somebody who's put in front of you, and what they're trying to do is find out how your systems work and function. So another intelligence agency or security agency would push an individual to you, and you'd pick up on that individual thinking that individual knew something or was willing to work for you, but actually it was a double agent, for want of a better word. And so obviously all security and intelligence services are fearful of that double agent being put forward. So I'm guessing in the first instance they wondered whether this guy, Smith, was a double agent, whether he's just a dangle, or a real walk-in, as we call them, a walk-in. Somebody walks into your embassy and says, listen, I want to give you something. So I don't think he was taken seriously. I think he had to prove himself. And so that's why he went out collecting and hoovering up anything he could to then pass it on to the Russians to show this is my bona fides. This is what I can actually do for you. And I would believe that then they took it seriously and thought, yeah, this guy probably knows something and we can probably use this guy. This guy will be good. So that is, I think, how he actually gets picked up to work for the Russians. And I don't know which body he's working for, but that's what he's doing. So that's the answer to that question. So that was part 1 of this week's Black Spy podcast. And hope you enjoyed it. We'll have part 2 next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
In the quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.